I have tread a well-worn path up and down 3 Mile Hill, an often overlooked stretch of trail that rises in the Berkshire Hills of western Massachusetts beneath the shadow of Monument Mountain in the small town where I live. This path, in a fittingly symbolic, albeit cliche fashion, has come to serve as a metaphor for my life over the last 7 years, since learning that my youngest of 3 daughters would be born with a congenital heart defect that would come to threaten her life. The topography of 3 Mile Hill boasts flat, unimpeded sections that I am able to sail through easily. There are other portions, narrow and treacherous, often riddled with rocks and slick with wet leaves, that always surprise me. There are uphill portions where I know to expect a challenge, and seemingly simple downhill sections that remind me of the importance of moving well before moving often. It is a path I know well, but it is not unusual, oftentimes when I am moving too quickly and I forget to breathe, to look up suddenly and realize that I'm no longer on the conventional path, the one marked by blue blazes on tree trunks that herald the way for followers. Just over a year ago, 14 months ago from today to be exact, when my youngest daughter died after an unsuccessful heart transplant, and I found the courage to leave a marriage of 15 years, I realized I'd reached a point of convergence. I had been given an opportunity to tell my own story boldly and creatively, or continue to live a life that was fueled by a script others had written for me. In choosing the former, I realized that I was going to need to step off of the conventional path, one on which I had grown incredibly comfortable, and forge my own way. My New England upbringing was steeped in convention. I was part of a nuclear family of 5 that remained intact and espoused waiting for the world to define me, rather than encouraging the declaration of who I was and helping me to bring that to fruition. I attended the all-girls boarding school, where my father taught math for more than 35 years. I gained early admission to college. I graduated in 4 years, and I met my parents' expectation that come September 1st, following said graduation, I'd have secured employment and I'd be living elsewhere. And just as my path stretched out before me, and I began to flirt with all the unconventional choices suddenly at my fingertips, I met someone, and I fell in love. And I fell quickly and happily back onto a conventional path that led me straight toward that which I had been so vehemently opposed for so long, following in my parents' footsteps. Not 2 years after graduating from St. Lawrence and moving to Boston to pursue a career in the arts, I found myself certified to teach English, and I was at a boarding school in the Berkshires, doing exactly what my parents had been doing when they were my age, teaching and living in a boys' dormitory. And just like that, the conventions started piling up. I got married. My husband and I built a house on land that my parents gave us for our wedding. And we started having babies in that order because that was the right order. And all the while, I began acquiring labels. I went from being seen as the difficult middle child, overly sensitive, often antagonistic, always a perfectionist, to later being judged as a selfish working mother, later a lazy stay-at-home mother, an overbearing wife, an English teacher whose expectations were too high, and all the while I became exhausted trying to manage everyone's impressions of me. But still, I looked to find the path that was going to work for me, and yet this terribly conventional crowd with which I had surrounded myself spoke loudly and clearly. Hannah's never happy, they said. There must be something wrong with Hannah. And I believed them. And by the tender age of 34, I was stuck. 7 years ago, on this bright and beautiful December day, my eyes were opened to a world void of convention for the very first time when I met my youngest daughter, and I was terrified. Cora was unconventional in every sense of the way. Spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, most notably physically. She had been diagnosed with hypoplastic left heart syndrome when she was just 19 weeks in utero. And for the first time in my life, no amount of planning, no amount of preparation, or striving for perfection was going to get me through what lay ahead. This picture of Cora on your left, taken when she was just moments old, is the only photo I have of her with her tiny, pink, and perfect chest intact. And I mourned this fact for a really long time until I came to finally make peace with the roadmap that would eventually cover her tiny body and ultimately tell a story of remarkable joy and perseverance born of profound obstacles. I would also go on to make peace with the fact that the seeds for my tremendous growth lay in the pain and the discomfort that both my daughter and I would go on to face in her short life. You see, with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, which is a single ventricle anomaly, and everyone used to always say that Cora was born with half a heart, but I think you can tell from the pictures you've seen already that that wasn't necessarily the case, except in physiological terms. It was a condition that, if not intervened upon, would be uniformly fatal. And so before I even met my daughter, I had made the difficult decision that she would undergo 3 open heart surgeries before she turned 2. The first of those took place when she was 2 days old. And she would go on to face myriad hospitalizations, routine interventions, and there were days that seemed like the dizzying amounts of medical supplies that spilled from the cupboards and the cabinets and the closets in our house would suffocate me. But all the while, Cora was so happy. She was thriving, actually. It was actually uncanny. You see, the only path Cora had ever known was the one that she was traveling. The doctors used to say, when they would round in the hospital, that not only had Cora not read the book on hypoplastic left heart syndrome, but that she was actually writing her own story, and, I might add, living fully in the present while doing so. In this veritable storm of uncertainty that had become our lives, on a personal path that was threatening to become chaotic and dysfunctional, I met someone who shared with me an invaluable kernel of wisdom. "You are the ship," my friend Thomas told me. "And if you go down, every single person on board with you is going to drown." He said, "You have to take care of yourself, because that's where your strength is. That's where you're going to find the way to survival." And so for the very first time in my life, I was actually left to contemplate this terribly uncomfortable space that I needed to get comfortable in. And this left me to contemplate my circle of control. Everything about Cora and her special heart was out of my circle of control. The 6 open heart surgeries she would go on to face, her pacemaker, her G-tube, her Mickey button, her tube feeds, her fluid restriction, her chronic vomiting, her PICC lines, her ART lines, her central lines, her lab draws, her Coumadin therapy, daily injections, visiting nurses, dressing changes, ER trips, ambulance rides, the fact that she needed a new heart, when she would get her new heart, how long she would live. It was all out of my control. It was overwhelming. But the beautiful part about every single thing that was out of my control was that it begged of me to consider what was in my control. And for the very first time, I realized that being present was in my control, that taking care of myself was in my control. And what did that look like? I logged a lot of hours at the gym. I spent a lot of hours drinking coffee with my friends. I like to get pedicures. I got a lot of pedicures. I also took breaks from parenting Cora to take care of my other 2 daughters who were desperate for a sense of normal. And I even found the courage to wrap Cora up when she was a baby and put her in the crib at the hospital and kiss her and say goodnight and go sleep in a hotel so that I could be rested. What this eventually ended up looking like was advocating for Cora and letting go, sending her to preschool on the white van with Miss Peggy and her friends, letting her jump on the trampoline and let her older sister show her how to do front flips, play t-ball in the backfield, and during snowstorms, go make snow angels with her sisters, all while wearing a tiny black backpack that for the final 8 months of Cora's life fueled her tiny broken heart through a pump-infused central line and allowed her to be at our house in the woods and not at Boston Children's Hospital. I was given the opportunity to parent a child who, by her very being in it, showed the world that she was not following the rules. It remains, perhaps, the very best gift I've ever been given. When Cora died, following what was ultimately deemed an unsuccessful heart transplant, and I found the courage to leave my marriage, I realized I'd reached a point of convergence, and I'd been given an opportunity to tell my own story boldly and creatively. And that's what I'm doing today, literally, but figuratively as well, as I'm still on that journey. There are plenty of outsiders who have looked in on Cora's short life with a tremendous amount of pity for all that she had to endure in her short life. A simple shift in perspective, however, reveals the freedom in her journey. Imagine how liberating and authentic life could be, with no concept of how others saw us, no concern as to what tomorrow holds, no feeling weighed down by the expectations that threaten so many of us. My shedding of conventions makes other people incredibly fearful. And as a result, it is often terribly isolating, like for all intents and purposes, I have the plague. My daughter's death makes other parents contemplate their own children's mortality. My choosing to get divorced leaves my married friends to scrutinize their matrimonial foundations. And my choosing to do freelance work, to be a writer, invites doubt on behalf of others who question how passionate they really are about the work that they have chosen to do. But, like my Spitfire of a 5-year-old daughter, I'm telling my own story, writing it actually, and I'm owning it every step of the way. One of my very dearest friends has a saying. He says, "An individual must first know dysfunction in order to know function." Now, he says this in his work as a functional movement specialist, and while of course it makes sense physically, it translates across all realms. My journey on 3 Mile Hill and in life has been an exercise in finding balance after having experienced dysfunction, function, convention, and lack thereof. My becoming congruent with myself has invited a tremendous amount of opportunity and a tremendous amount of liberation insofar as it has let me let go of what others expect of me. So today, despite the fact that this beautiful little girl who showed me the way is no longer here with us physically, Cora continues to illuminate my path. And as a result, today, the focus of my journey is not on what others expect of me, rather what I expect of myself, something most certainly in my circle of control. Thank you.